right, you ready, Ron?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
3, 2, 1, go.
Tug-of-war videos are really entertaining, but they're not particularly useful when it comes to actually assessing the quality of a product, especially pickup trucks. For those of you interested in the EV space, or perhaps just interested in the truck space, you've probably heard about Lordstown Motors and their 2021 Endurance pickup truck. If not, let me give some background on the company. Lordstown Motors is an electric truck manufacturer that has recently come into the fray. They've been developing and working on this plant they purchased from GM for quite some time now, and they're aiming to be the very first manufacturer of an electric pickup in the United States. This is a photo of the plant, and as we go down the page, it details some of the specifications and how large the plant is. This was a fairly big GM facility, and Lordstown got it for a pretty good price. But at the same time, you need to understand that setting up manufacturing lines is very specific for many different types of manufacturing. So factory space in a specific factory might not actually be worth as much as you expect. The CEO, Steve Burns, is also very active. He's made a lot of appearances on tons of different shows, and he is pretty active on social media. Lordstown Motors is currently trading under the ticker symbol RIDE, and they actually just recently went public via a SPAC. As we can see, there's been a huge spike up and a lot of volatility, which is not surprising for such an early EV company. It's something we've seen a lot in these different companies. But they've climbed a significant amount since that SPAC merger, and the public trading has been pretty wild. What's also interesting is that GM actually took a very large stake in the company, as well as a smaller company known as Workhorse. GM invested around $75 million into the company before the SPAC, and Workhorse has around a 10% stake in Lordstown Motors. And the partnership is so deep that Workhorse is actually making money off Endurance sales. For those unfamiliar, I made a video about Workhorse electric vans detailing their whole strategy and what they're involved in. They're also an electric vehicle manufacturer that is mainly focused on these very specific delivery style vans for last mile deliveries. I'll have this video linked in the description below, as well as in the title card of this video. The Endurance is the primary focus of the company and what they've dumped all of their assets into producing. Currently, their goal is to start producing some in small volume production in fall of 2021, and then ramp up in 2022. We've had continued updates, but manufacturing is difficult, and I would not be surprised if we see some sort of delay. Going through some of the details on the vehicle, it's actually sort of interesting. They're taking a dramatically different approach compared to most other electric vehicles, where they're actually using hub motors. They're using 4 independent hub motors to get their all-wheel drive, as well as independent and sort of a sophisticated all-wheel drive. Whenever you have separate power delivery for each wheel, you can do a lot of fancy tricks, assuming your software is sophisticated enough. And like many EVs, they have a very small amount of moving parts. So it's a rather interesting and unique design, different from many other manufacturers, and they really like to show off these hub motors. They're a bright orange finish, and they stick out a lot, actually. They're probably one of the first things you notice about the vehicle. As for the actual design specs, they're targeting a $52,500 starting price. They list a couple safety ratings, but I couldn't find any proper reports from regulatory agencies, so I wonder if this is expected. But they go through a lot of points, the biggest probably being the range, 250 miles or more. They advertise on the EPA cycle, which many people criticize for not being super realistic, but that's a standard that EVs in the US are going to be using. Battery size is 109 kilowatt hours. Charging time from 20% battery to 80% battery is 10 hours on standard wall charger, but if you have a level 2 or level 3, you can go all the way down to 1.5 hours. Of course, it's going to have off-board power for tools and accessories, which is super handy. A 110 volt, 120 volt, 20 amp circuit is basically something you would find right in your house. Seating capacity of 5, towing capacity of 7,500. They're going to be using a custom type of hub rotor brake, and they have 20-inch wheels with peak horsepower of 600. One of the very interesting points, though, is they govern the top speed to 80 miles an hour, which is a bit smaller than many other EVs, even ones that used fixed gear layouts. Some might say you don't need to go faster in a truck, but you have to keep in mind there are tons of highways in the US that have a top speed limit above 80. Now, depending on how windy it is, you might not want to do that in a truck, but that's up to your discretion, I would say. So if you know anything about trucks, if you've been looking at these specs, it's actually pretty comparable to many other entry-level four-wheel drive trucks. Here they have their comparison to the Ford F-150, and then they also talk about the total cost over the ownership lifetime of the vehicle, simply because gasoline is not particularly expensive right now, and I think $250 is probably a bit excessive, but you do have to consider that trucks just use a lot of fuel. They're just not as efficient than a sedan. So even if fuel is relatively cheap, you're still going to be spending a fair amount on it. And the company has generated a lot of hype. There are many people deeply interested in this company. They've gotten a decent amount of investment from even big players like GM. And what's interesting is that GM actually opened up their parts to Lordstown. So Lordstown is making these trucks with a lot of GM parts. They have a whole supply chain. This is the product that they're banking on, and they have tons of graphics showing off how it looks, the entire drivetrain compared to an ICE vehicle. And as you can see, they're using a skateboard style design. For MPG equivalent, 75 isn't awful for a truck. It's not insane like the 130 plus numbers we get from Teslas, but for a truck that is way less aerodynamic, it makes a fair bit of sense, I would say. And they really do emphasize the hub motors. And I'd say that is one thing that really does set it apart. That is dramatically different from many other manufacturers. I've seen a lot of hub motors on electric bicycles, like e-bikes, things like that, but never on a large vehicle like this. So we'll see how that pans out, how the performance is, whether they can keep them cool. I think it's kind of interesting. I'm curious whenever a manufacturer does something dramatically different from the standard, but sometimes dramatically different from the standard is what makes a successful company. And it's certainly an interesting design. It's more of a traditional look than, say, something like the Cybertruck. And as they show, traditional motor gearbox combinations on other EV skateboard platforms sort of look like this, where you have your reduction gear system, it feeds into a diff, and you get all of this. This is sort of the layout of their hub motor. It's fairly simple, and you have almost everything sort of baked into it. I imagine one of the big advantages would probably be manufacturing costs. Rather than having a front and rear drive assembly or anything like that, you just have this motor and you're just feeding it with electricity. And if you want to change certain aspects, you just build it with a different built-in gearing ratio, other things like that. And four motors is obviously pretty handy if you're going to be dealing with anything off-road. Four-wheel drive is always nice, especially if you're living in a place that sees varied climates or a very cold climate where you get snow, other things like that. And what's pretty good is they're also doing some vibrational and shock testing on these, which I think is fantastic. One of the big concerns with any motor that uses permanent magnets is permanent magnets actually degrade when exposed to heat and shock. So performance could go down over time if the motors aren't properly designed. So it's pretty fascinating. They really like to show it off. They have some beautiful graphics on the website, but of course that's a pretty graphic doesn't make some crazy compelling product. They're advertising a 5.5 0 to 60, which is quite good for a big heavy truck, especially a battery-powered truck. 600 peak horsepower, I can't imagine that would be the standard, but again, it depends on how the motor and power management system is going to cope with all of this. And actually, the battery might be the biggest point, because battery cooling is pretty significant, and it doesn't really look like they have a radiator here, but a lot of this is still developing. Like we saw in their news report, they are in the beta stage for manufacturing, so likely the design is finalized, but they just need to see if they need to tweak a couple things to make it more manufacturable. They advertise pretty good charging speeds and all of these other aspects of the vehicle. It really is fascinating, and they give a very pretty, happy view of what an electric truck could be, especially one with a more conservative design, right? It looks more like a traditional truck than, say, some of the more out there ones like the Cybertruck. And they're saying they're going to be the first electric pickup truck sold in the United States commercially. And that is what they're banking on. If you're investing in this stock, you're investing in that idea of the endurance pickup truck. That's where all their money has gone, all their engineering talent. That's what they're focusing on, and that's what they intend to have as their major product. However, interestingly enough, they talk about how they are really focusing on the commercial space, not the retail space. In fact, let me give you the perspective from the CEO of the company during a CNBC interview.
All right, so give us the value proposition for the Endurance, because it isn't exactly like every other pickup we've ever seen.
Yeah. Well, we sell to commercial fleets. That's our first customer. And like you said, we've already got 50,000 pre-orders. And when you sell to fleets, we couldn't do what most EV companies are doing, where you come out with a luxury price point and move downstream. You know, a fleet guy would get fired for buying a luxury truck. So we had to come out on par with the gas trucks pricing. And to do that, we had to invent a new drivetrain. And that drivetrain had to be reasonably priced, but rough and tough enough, what people expect of a modern day pickup truck. I mean, they think it should be able to climb a wall and haul and tow. So we used hub motors.
And the company does look to be taking a pretty aggressive approach to getting their product on the market. Recently, they made a lot of news by trying to get exemption in a lot of states to sell directly to customers. If you've kept up with this, this is something that Tesla has dealt with a lot. Tesla doesn't have any dealerships. They sell directly. And as strange as it might sound, that's actually illegal in a lot of states. So when you're buying a Tesla in Texas, they actually had to go to court over this. You can't go to one of their stores and just buy it. You have to purchase it online and have the server hosted in a different state. So it's incredibly strange, but that's how some states are, which is kind of obnoxious. And if you can think about it, it makes a lot of sense for a manufacturer to try to sell directly to a consumer. There are advantages to having a dealership network, but in general, it's going to be more beneficial to do direct sales because you get way more margin. You don't have to worry about any franchise issues or any other middlemen, which really that's what car dealerships are. They're middlemen. You can ignore a lot of that and really develop your brand a lot more. I think that a lot of the traditional brands would probably be quite happy if they could get away from the dealership model, but they already have entrenched partnerships and in some states legal requirements. So it's not as simple as it sounds. But with a new brand like Lordstown Motors it makes a lot of sense. And funnily enough, Lordstown, which is based in Lordstown, Ohio, actually can't directly sell their vehicles in Ohio. Ohio is one of the states that prohibits those direct-to-manufacturer sales of vehicles. So they're trying to deal with that and lobby for legislation that would allow it. So a lot of this probably sounds pretty cool. You've probably seen some videos of the alpha builds or beta builds of this truck in action, and it might seem pretty intense, pretty awesome. You know, the very first electric pickup truck on the market in America. There's a lot of passion behind the CEO. He claims to have crazy huge pre-order numbers, and when you consider the price, it actually is pretty competitive compared to many other trucks out there. So it looks cool, it's appealing, they have all these cool promo videos, and you might even be ready to pre-order one right now. You're like, I really need a Lordstown Motors truck. It just looks intense, it seems intense, and it's a product that's going to change a lot of the vehicle market, especially when it comes to construction and other major purchasers of trucks besides retail. The biggest concern or hesitation I would have about a stock like this would mainly be the fact that they aren't selling any vehicles right now. Yes, they're talking about production. They're being aggressive with their production timelines and trying to sell direct to other things like that. But you need to understand that they haven't made anything yet. They don't have a completed pilot line for production units. They're still talking about finalizing their beta designs and getting production units in fall of this year. And the company is losing money, unsurprisingly. They're not selling anything. So whenever you're investing in a company that is not profitable, you have to stop and consider the risks. If they successfully transition to manufacturing, that's going to be huge. They just hammered out tons of that execution risk and are likely going to go up in price a fair bit. You know, the EV space really is the future. It's been growing like crazy and developing and maturing so quickly that being one of the early companies in this space with a product like this, which is an especially good product, because if you think about these trucks for work use, like on construction sites, that is a space that isn't going to be automated as quickly as consumer transportation. Robo-taxis are not that far away. And when you're selling maybe an EV that's like a small, crappy little commuter car, you do need to be concerned, right? Because what is going to be the point of those vehicles in a few years when robo-taxis are around and urban vehicles just won't make much sense because it's so cheap to get an automated ride to where you want to go. Now, obviously, there's complications with legal allowances and other things like that. There's a lot of things that go into it, and there could be slowdowns, but we've seen such incredible progress from so many big players in the space that I think it's not unreasonable to have a concern about a consumer commuter vehicle, right? But when you're dealing with something that is really big on construction, other things like that, or like personal farms, all of that, when you're dealing with a vehicle like that, you are no longer in the just commuter space. It's used for work, not just automated commuting. So I certainly do think it is a compelling product in that sense, if they can get it manufactured and start selling it, and assuming they don't have any issues with what they sell, you know? It's important to make something, and it's also important to have proper quality control on what you make. If we look at U.S. auto sales by model, we see the top selling models are the Ford F-Series, a truck, Chevy Silverado, a truck, Ram pickup, a truck. There are a couple cars that do sell quite well, but those cheap, tiny cars that do sell well are kind of the exception. Trucks have insane sales in the U.S. The top 3 models of vehicles sold in the U.S. are all trucks. You know, the country is obsessed with trucks. So if you can get into the truck space with an electric truck, with a vehicle that is going to propel the future forward, it's going to be pretty significant, especially because a lot of work done with a truck is something that can't be automated. It's not taking you to Starbucks or whatever, right? It's not a replacement for a cheap urban vehicle. So I certainly think this is a company with a lot of potential. They seem to really be trying hard to get their product to market. They've been taking an aggressive stance, giving us lots of updates and YouTube videos, things like that. But whenever you're dealing with something like this, the biggest concern will always be the execution risk. Can they start that volume production without issue? And when they start that volume production, are they capable of supplying their batteries, things like that? They're not making their own batteries. They're getting them from suppliers. And that's going to be more and more constrained as more and more companies enter the space. Batteries are just going to get more and more expensive. They're going to be harder to get a hand on. So that's really the biggest concern, that execution risk of scaling up a product and, of course, having good quality control on that product. I think this company has a lot of potential, and it's interesting to see their partnerships with GM and Workhorse, but you do always need to take into account they technically aren't selling anything yet, and they're not profitable yet, right? This is a riskier investment than, say, an ETF, you know, like SPY or something like that, which should sound obvious, but you always have to consider that, hey, if you tossed your money into a large ETF, you're probably going to be seeing a 10% annualized return. How long are you going to be waiting for RIDE to scale up and, you know, gain value? Are you going to beat that 10% by the end of the year? What is that space going to look like? Are they going to cope with this execution risk? These are all questions you should be asking yourself, but this certainly is an interesting stock that's garnered a lot of warranted attention, I think. If you're interested in investing in the market with self-directed trading, a fantastic way to start is with Webull. If you sign up now using my referral link in the description of this video, you'll get 2 free stocks valued up to $1,850. And these stocks are selected from companies like Facebook, Starbucks, Snap, Google, Procter, Gamble, and more. All the money in your account is yours to invest, trade, and withdraw as you please. There are 0 fees associated with depositing money. You just get your stocks and you'll get your buying power immediately. So if you want a fantastic brokerage with mobile, desktop, and web trading, just use the link in the description below.